so much for joining us. So before we get started with our content, I think we have some really good ideas. The structure is going to be sort of me setting a little foundation and then Tina showing how it emerges in her class, and then me setting another foundation and Tina showing how it emerges in her class. And we came up with these foundational ideas together, thinking about our backgrounds and our students. So hopefully they'll be useful. We invite you as we go throughout to also weigh in, to use the chat as a back channel. We're so excited that you're here. We were talking about if people didn't come, would we record it? And Tina and I both agreed, like, we don't want the conversation. So keep that going in the chat, and then we'll have times for you to unmute and have conversation that way as well. So before we get started, I would like you to pull up your chat window, and you're going to type in the chat, but you're not going to hit enter quite yet. So this is something I love to do with my students, so that the students that need a little more time to gather their thoughts have time to do that. So pull up the chat window, and here's what I want you to think about. When you hear the word rigor, what are the first words that come to mind? So what you might type in the chat window are just those associative words. What are words you associate with rigor? Take about 30 seconds, don't hit enter yet, and type a couple associative words. And then here's the second part of our question. How might you, let's say in one sentence, because we could go about this for forever, how might you define either a rigorous course or a rigorous assignment in one sentence? Think about one. Talking while I'm muted. Give you about 10 seconds to finish your sentence. And go ahead and hit enter.
Oops, I didn't actually do it.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. So I'm looking in the chat here and I'm seeing that we see structure and order, quality hard work, tightly defined hard work. That's good. Mine's engaging and interactive. So we understand that rigor isn't just hard, right? It's quality hard work, or hard work for a purpose. So we're already ahead of the curve there. You guys are A+ students. You get a start for the day. We also understand that rigorous courses meet standards. We understand that there's clearly defined outcomes. That's going to connect to one of our foundational ideas. Can we have both applied and conceptual rigorous courses? That's a good question. Let's hold on to that idea. And then for me, I think a writing assignment, students have to think critically, of course, like that's what rigor is, but there also has to be like this process, right? This iterative process of giving and receiving feedback. And I think that giving feedback is really key. So we're going to come back to that as well. So before we go too much further, I'm going to share the handout in the chat so you can follow along, because we like to see faces rather than the handout. So I'll draw your attention to a quote. I'll wait until you all get there if you choose to do so. But the quote that really has redefined the way that I think about rigor, and that sort of creates our foundational idea number one about rigor, is a quote by authors Kylene Beers and Bob Probst. You probably don't know these folks. They are education scholars. In fact, they work mostly in the classroom with secondary English education. But this was revelatory to me. So they say, or they wrote in a book in 2012, rigor is not an attribute of a text, but rather a characteristic of our behavior with the text. So put another way, rigor resides in the energy and attention given to the text, not the text itself. So again, I want to pause for a couple seconds and ask you, how might this definition, the energy and attention given to the text, help us think about how rigor can emerge in writing assignments? Do you have any ideas there? You can feel free to unmute. I also need to tell you all that my wait time has gotten really good, so I can sit here all day.
I'm thinking energy and attention.
Interaction.
Attention is hard, I think. So when I think about how I ask my students to engage with textbook, but then also, current policy issues. So those things usually are, I mean, headline, they're doing 1,000 different things. Many of them are mid-career. So attention is actually hard. They have energy because they're in a program, they're excited about it. They get to pick their own topic in my course, which they love, and you can feel that energy. The attention, though, because we teach our courses, there's 16 weeks of content in 8, that giving them an opportunity for attention is a challenge. And so I used to do sort of worksheets that would apply the readings, that I hated that because I was trying to give them the attention, but I know they did. It's just, I think having to write provides more opportunity for attention and energy. So, and it gives them a chance to translate their enthusiasm, which is
There you
nice.
go. There you
Yeah.
go. So I think that's going to directly connect to our foundational idea number 2. You're ahead of the game. Let me give you another example from Beers and Probst just to think about as we go on, and then I'll pass it over to Tina for her idea about foundational idea number 1. But Beers and Probst say that you can give high school students, for example, and I love using high school students because it's a nice baseline for us, right? You can give them an example or a copy of Beowulf. You could say, here is Beowulf, the oldest known text that we still read in schools for some unknown reason, but that's a different conversation. Beowulf is very hard. You spend all of your time and energy and attention trying to figure out what the hell they're saying in Beowulf when you're teaching it to 10th graders. Trust me on this, I've done it. So what if instead you gave them a graphic novel version of Beowulf, and then the time and energy and attention isn't going into decoding Old English, which doesn't exist anymore. So why would we do that? It's not to our course objectives, right? But instead, all their time and energy goes into thinking about themes and implications and historical references and the stuff we want them to think about in high school English, not just figuring out plot, right? So this idea of energy and attention to me means making it accessible, even really hard content, in a way that they talk about what we want them to talk about, and they're not trying to sort of like parse through stuff that doesn't matter. So that's foundational idea number 1 on our handout. We're in a moment to rethink what rigor looks like in the university online WI classroom, because as you've learned, everything takes longer on Zoom and no one has attention right now at all, right? So that's one way I've defined it, is really thought about what assignments can I take out that truly are not contributing to the learning outcomes of my course, that kind of have become busy work, right? And what assignments can I double down on and say, these are the ones that are worth spending our time and energy and attention on? Tina, I'll pass it over to you for foundational idea 1.
Okay, so when I think of rigor, I think of it as heavy thinking. I always go back to Bloom's from grad school and try to think about where I want my bang for the buck. And, busy work is a thing that I just don't do. I teach only asynchronous, only undergraduate, non-majors, but I have 5 sections, and one of them is writing intensive, but the other classes are along the same lines in general. And one of the things that I also do to bring rigor in the course, and I think really kind of goes to what Angie was saying, is you can't give it from one perspective. The textbook alone is not enough. And so I try to bring in external resources to take the students away from the textbook and use the textbook for the foundational content knowledge, and then to try to get them to go and explore more modern or relevant sources, academic and non-academic, because you can learn a lot from a blog sometimes if the blogger's good. And so the idea is to have them triangulate's not the right word, but to take a variety of sources and come up with something that's maybe a little richer and more nuanced than a simple Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of something.
I love what you said. I was trying to type it, but then I was doing too many things at once. It was very important that I add the cat vibing GIF to the bottom of the handout. It's there if you want to look at it. It's appeared everywhere. But what I really love is you thinking about breaking down that dichotomy between academic and non-academic, right? Because in reality, a lot of the really good stuff sort of hangs out in the middle. And when we think about public scholars, for example, I think about Tressie Cottom and other sociologists like her that are doing really good work in the middle. And so sometimes a Medium post is the best thing to read on a topic, right? And you compare it with the textbook, et cetera. I love that. Okay, so foundational idea number 2 directly, oh no, I lost my handout because of the cat vibing. Okay, foundational idea number 2 directly connects to what Angie and Tina were talking about earlier, and that is that rigor starts with the faculty member and the course design. And so it includes both good organization and clear communication. And I would also add a clear focus on what outcomes are, right? So here's an example. When we shift online, we often throw at faculty members, and I say we as in faculty development folks like myself, we often throw a bunch of tech tools at faculty members, right? Remember when the March shift happened and all the workshops were like, here's VoiceThread and here's Flipgrid and here's like all these different tools, right? Those are great and they're really important. But I think sometimes those tools don't actually increase rigor, don't increase the attention and energy. In fact, they make students focus on things that aren't what we want them to focus on. Like they're spending forever trying to figure out how to upload a VoiceThread video instead of responding to the text that we want them to respond to, right? So I think foundational idea number 2 for me is thinking about what is the most rigorous tool for the job. So sometimes the most rigorous tool for the job, especially when we spend all day staring at ourselves in a Zoom screen, is pen and paper. So I like to use concept maps. And I know that concept maps seem like they aren't rigorous because they're not complete sentences and they're often not pre-organized like a paper is, but they sometimes show the really heavy thinking because they focus on those connections and they focus on assimilating the reading material, the lecture material, and the student's own background knowledge into one document. So I work closely with the faculty member in biochem. I call him my pen pal because he emails me like once a week. In fact, I need to email him back right now. I have an email sitting in my inbox. And he said, here's the thing. I'm so tired of reading papers. Like this is a writing intensive class and there's just so many papers. I need to test them on their reading of this book. It's this little thin sort of like biographical book about a biochemist. But I need to do so in a way that actually is interesting because they're not going to do it otherwise and it's not going to be useful. Then I said, well, how about you make concept maps and you give them a sample concept map and then tell them what the goal of that map is. And so we worked it up and it was beautiful. And he made this Microsoft Word one that had all these cool boxes. And I said, when they take that quiz, will they spend most of their time thinking about how to put the boxes in Microsoft Word? Or will they spend most of their time assimilating the text? And he's like, oh, that's a good point. So we actually ended up letting them do it on pen and paper. And they wrote their concept map out, snapped it, uploaded it on Canvas, and they are incredible. They are fast to grade. They do way more work than an actual paper would do because they're not thinking about formatting a paper. They're thinking about the learning. And they were so fun to look at. Everyone did it differently. So that's my takeaway from foundational idea number 2 is that pick one tech tool and use it consistently and consider what is the best tool for the job. And sometimes it might just be paper. Tina?
Okay, I want to follow up on what you just said. I don't actually use a concept map in my writing intensive course, but I use it in one of my other courses. And the follow-up to that is, first of all, they should absolutely create their own bubbles because if they don't, they're missing out on things. But the other thing about that is I had them write a short essay afterwards, a 1-page essay where they connect those concepts from the map in a way that makes sense to them. And then I make them reflect on the process. And this is not very popular because it's a science class they're actually doing this in. And they're like, why am I talking about what I learned in a concept map? But by making them address their aha moment, I'm actually making them understand they're learning something from this, not just doing it. So that would just be my follow-up to that. And then for me, a big part of it is everybody wants to force you into new tech. And again, I've been teaching online forever. I love gadgets. I am definitely a tech person, but I have told every publisher known to mankind that no, I don't want this fancy drill downable textbook that does everything in like 1 paragraph or less. And I don't want to use all these fancy things. I like to start with a solid core. And then as you experience what your students are capable of, then I have slowly expanded. And so now I'm doing more than I would have, say, 5 years ago. But I needed to make sure that I understood the tech and how it was going to be interacting with the students and whether or not it was going to break down, whether it was overly complicated. Anything that's viewed as busy work is blown off. I mean, that's just, my classes, again, are all asynchronous. And so I'm the same thing as like, why is this important for me to do? And so I have really, I do a lot of publisher integrated activities, and we'll talk about that later, but all the writing happens for me on Canvas, and really SpeedGrader is the only, SpeedGrader and rubrics and Canvas are all I need. I mean, there are some nice things, but even the copy paste specific answers to the questions that I've seen, I can't remember what that program is called, where it just like keystrokes and you get text. That's impersonal in the writing intensive course. I feel like they need to have those comments directly from us, text expander. So I really like to have that, well, you did this right or you didn't do that right. And so it's just picking what works for you, I'm also about efficiency. So don't do anything that takes 5 minutes more than you need to spend on a paper, but still gets the best information back to the student.
I love that. Yeah, I think text expander, which is Jonathan Cisco loves it and he is like the expert at it. I think that has a time and a place, but we wouldn't want to always use it, right? So it's all about a
Right.
balance, the same thing as tech and paper. I love that. You know, on that point and moving into foundational idea number 3. So I decided when I was teaching my classes online synchronous this semester for the first time, undergraduates in the College of Ed, I usually go into the speed grader document and I highlight and I make little annotations with the highlights, like we all do this, you know, kind of like you can in Microsoft Word. But I realized that that wasn't being read for 2 reasons. One is Canvas does not make it easy for them to find those comments. And if you don't know how to find those comments, I can show you how, because there's like a little, they gave me language I gave to my students. So the in-text comments are hard for students to find because you have to go through these like this rigmarole of Canvas. But secondly, they were really wanting a conversation, right? And we all kind of want conversations right now because we are so distanced from people. And so I decided that I was going to make my responses to their sort of informal papers. They do reading responses on the text that we read, all about a conversation. And so as I read them, I literally like write this stream of consciousness sort of response that's all about content. And what I noticed is they were emailing me back within minutes after submitting that for 2 reasons. I put it in the box that's like the assignment comments box on Canvas. So it was emailed directly to them. And secondly, I asked questions. I put stupid things like the cat vibing GIF in there. I linked them to blogs and to Twitter posts and to other things that could like double down on the academic text we're reading. And they really started to see the course content as a conversation and a cohesive story. And now they're emailing me things. It's so cool. So I think Rigor has helped me, or online classes have helped me think about how feedback and rigor go together. And then another thing I often say about foundational idea number 3, which is that rigorous courses display content as a cohesive story, is that I often think about who's doing the most work in the room, right? So if I go into a classroom and do a peer observation or observe a high school teacher, I will often say like, who's doing the most work in this room? And very often it's the teacher, right? Because that's what we do. Like, that's why we're good at what we do. We know the things and we know how to do them. But the person who learns the most is the person who does the most work in the room. And so when I think about that, I think about designing really good, sorry, Angie, I'll get to you in just a second. Assignments on the front end. I lost my train of thought. It wasn't your fault, Angie. Really good assignments on the front end, and then letting them go do it, and then giving really good feedback on the back end. Yeah, Angie, weigh in.
Do you have any suggestions on how to handle the guilt when you have structured a class so that they're doing so much and I'm sitting there just waiting for stuff to roll in? You know, I mean, really. And so my summer classes are like this in particular because it's human resources. So it's not as, the thing about policy processes, because the content can be, I mean, I'm reading something every single day for policy processes, like in the Wall Street Journal or what, I mean, you know, lots and lots and lots of stuff. HR, not so much. There was one time you can't discriminate anymore nationally or federally if you're gay, and you know, so that was huge. Like HR is like so seriously, how do I handle the like, this is a real thing. How do I handle the guilt? Like when I give them so much and they're doing the hardest amount of work, how do I get better at sitting with that? Even though I know that when I see the outcomes, they're usually pretty good. You know, it's when, if something didn't turn out the way that I wanted, and if I have more than about 2 people in the class that, and that's very rare. Usually it's 1 or 2 that maybe didn't do as well as others. Like, how do I handle that? I know that sounds ridiculous, but how do I handle it that they're doing most of the work?
Well, I have a quick idea, and I'm going to invite Danielle and Tina to weigh in too. So I feel that same guilt, but it's me as an English teacher not correcting grammar, right? Like that's the thing. Like I see all these mistakes.
That's the thing. Yeah, you want to do the whole thing, right? Yeah, I know.
Right, but then you're rewriting it for them.
Exactly. So I think that's why my feedback this semester that's become really a conversation with them has been so revelatory to me, because I'm like, oh, wait, if I don't correct their grammar and actually talk about the things that I care about, they actually interact with me. So like, it's been a long, slow burn that I'm like, this is worth it. I also think, Angie, here's my practical tip. Working in checkpoints for those assignments, and then giving them that kind of feedback, not the grammar stuff, but the literal like stream of consciousness sort of feedback, maybe even via a video comment, so you don't have to type it. Working in checkpoints, I think, will lessen the time between you giving the assignment and you giving feedback on the assignment or grading or whatever you want to call it, and
Mhm.
make you feel like you're actually supporting them, and it will give students what they need. I will also say one person in another faculty development group that I'm in, they started giving different deadlines for their assignments, and they would say, okay, if you want really good feedback where I'm like having a conversation with you, it's going to be due this
Ah.
date, a little bit earlier. If you just want the rubric and the grade, that's totally fine too, because some of us just need to pass this class, then it's due by this date. And I was like, I actually kind of like that. I wouldn't do it for every assignment, but I would do it for ones that it didn't matter if I gave a bunch of feedback to, I think.
That's a really cool idea.
I
Yeah,
like
I
that one a lot.
wish I could remember who said it. I need to figure that out. Tina and Danielle, do you have ideas of how to deal with this guilt of like, I gave a really good assignment, now I'm sitting back and waiting?
I don't have any guilt on those things at all because I figure I pay it out in other courses and other assignments. But as long as you're giving the best assignment that you can, that's where I think your work is on the front end. So you're not seeing it while they're doing it, but you have already done the good work to get it to the point that they have a good assignment to do.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's true. I remember
Yeah.
I didn't know I was going to go under quality course review this until I was the middle of the semester. And I'm like, what? We could have done this in the summer, because it takes a lot of, I mean, what I ended up doing, we were moving our classes from 9 to 8 to align with the university calendar. Thank God. But we were also doing quality course review. And I was like, well, I'm doing it all at once. Like I'm not going to, cause I have to change it to 8 weeks in January. So I'm just going to do it all at once. And it takes a long time because I restructured some assignments and then I'm not sending them out without rubrics, I mean, and I'm not launching the course until that's all done so that I know what the outcomes are. And so actually it's interesting when in one of the classes, I actually give them because it's an intuitive enough question, which comes first? Does collaborative governance come out of the problem at hand, or does the problem affect the way? So is it structure first and then the problem, or problem and then structure? And because structures can create problems, so it gets complicated. I gave it to them on the first day of class. The trouble with that is when I taught them the next semester, they were like, well, what are we doing at the end of class? Like, what are we going for? So I was like, okay, fine. You want to do the final now? And then they freaked out because they saw how much they were going to learn. And I was like, this is why I didn't give it to you, because I knew it's different, but that is the thing. When I spend that time planning, then I have much more assurance when I'm giving them all that stuff. But every once in a while, I think I haven't had to restructure this class much because I'm getting everything I want and they're getting what they need, and then there's that. I do think there's that element of, I wouldn't call it imposter syndrome, but have I really done everything I can do? And I think a lot of the times, given the things that are coming out, yeah, they end up taking a lot of their stuff back, their writings back, and using them at work, which is cool, which is really cool. But there's always sort of, I think, that self-doubt, but anyway, that's certainly very me. I mean, that is a personality thing. I was like, oh, but that's because Tina's a scientist. You're so
I think like a scientist
so
more
good.
I think the flow chart and checklist.
Yeah, I mean, you're just like, no, and I'm all like, oh God, life is policy is a process. It's never end. Like I tell them election day is neither the beginning nor the end, which is true. I was like, so yeah, for me, I think part of it is topic, personality, and that kind of thing. So,
and what you've made me think of, Angie, first of all, I love the Mark Twain quote that is totally me, and it sounds like it's you, that he says he is a victim of a trained Presbyterian conscience who feels guilty for the sins of the world. And I'm like, oh, that's me. Like I'm constantly feeling guilty about something.
yeah.
But I think an element of rigor we haven't yet talked about that could be really useful to this thinking too, and for our students, is that rigor requires unlearning, right? And so
yeah.
what we're doing
that's
here
true. Yeah.
is thinking about unlearning what good teaching looks like. And good teaching used to look like the sage on the stage doing the most work. but that doesn't work. And Zoom has totally shown us that that does not work, right? It never works anyway in the classroom, but it definitely doesn't work on Zoom. And so I think that unlearning as part of rigor and unlearning those teaching practices that feel good as you make your rigorous course is important. And Danielle unmuted, so I want to see what she has to say too.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm probably more in lines with Tina in terms of I don't feel the guilt quite as much.
I used to. It took a long time to unlearn that myself, but now I'm like, nope, I put on all this time over my Christmas break. You're fine.
I used to be a graduate TA for a very, very large writing intensive course, and there was just no room for it. You had to get it. You had to get all that grading done, and you couldn't worry about those things. So the grading just sort of overshadowed all of it. I think one of the interesting things is, and maybe it's slightly different because in methods of research, if you don't get the APA formatting in as you're writing it, it's going to mess up everything from the get-go. So I hark on my students about APA, and I still now in week 13? I don't even know what week we're in right now. They're still making the same mistakes that I've marked up over and over and over again. I'm like, is it just the feedback I'm giving? Because I put all my feedback in the speed grader. I had a Zoom chat with one of my students not all that long ago, because I try to mix up the assignments. I try to make smaller chunks now. I broke up the course a little bit instead of just having, here's the midpoint, here's the end, and you
no.
And when we have discussion boards for how to work through different things before, but I started making these more intermediary, smaller chunked pieces, like give me a draft of the methods, it could be bullet points, it could be whatever. But what I'm seeing is when I talk with them individually, because they want to think through a little bit more about what it is, they don't know how to read my comments in SpeedGrader. Like they're like, yeah, it just shows up as like this big highlighted bar, or it crosses everything out and I can't see what you're writing. I'm like, so I like showed them my screen and I showed them how it works, and like, I didn't know how that works. And I'm like, you've been in our online program because our program's all online. So I was like, you've been in our program, and he's getting ready to graduate. He didn't know how to do this. And it was like, I am so lost right now.
Okay, so 2 points on that, Danielle. I have the same problem, and it depends on the browser, I think. So here's what I've learned recently. And apparently Canvas is like, that's the thing that happens, and they're not helping. So in Google Chrome, they can actually see through it. It's not like a bar, the highlighting,
Yeah.
They can actually see through it. But if we put it in Google Chrome, you can't like get the right spot, like it jumps around the page, right?
Yeah.
But so if you do it in Safari, I have a Mac, obviously, you can get the right spot, but it becomes like a bar. And so I'll like highlight something and then go to type and forget what I was going to type and have to like move the bar and all of that. So I'm going to give this feedback again to the ET@Mo folks and say, this is not useful. I also will say part of what our students didn't understand is I put the ET@Mo gave me those directions, the directions for actually viewing the feedback. But I think your point is also twofold. I'm wondering if the attention is the problem there, if you think about the energy and the attention. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you can do less. So I'm going to make a suggestion that won't work because Canvas is screwed up. But when that happens, for when I used to teach writing classes, like composition classes, for example, by the 10th week of the semester, I just start highlighting stuff and be like, this is wrong and this is wrong, and you figure it out. Like, I'm not going to do it. Have you done that?
I've started doing that because just the time and effort there's 30 students in that class, and there's 40 in my other class. So I'm just like constant. I live in SpeedGrader. Like there is nothing but SpeedGrader at this point, because so I've started just marking it and going, and I'll write one note at the top, one example, and I said, this is what it is. I'm just going to mark every instance I see, because you're going to miss this if I leave it up to you to go do it, because you should have done it from the get-go, like I told you in the first 3 assignments. So it's like, I don't know. And I don't know if it's a SpeedGrader issue that they don't see it. With one student, it was, and I think I've corrected that now, but it took me to week 10 to get to that point because they didn't reach out to me to week 10. So it's kind of like that asynchronous trap of you don't know what they're thinking. Even when you ask them, because we have we have class level Zoom synchronous sessions where I answer these questions and I walk through these things with them, but still at the individual level, it's kind of like, oh, I'm not going to tell you.
Some students don't care that much. They just write off the APA points in my class.
Mhm.
And the way I do that with the writing intensive, and I have about between 70 and 75 a semester in my writing intensive course. And I have a TA who I assign her to grade the big papers because I'm a big believer in the same person should grade everything so that they're being graded consistently. So I train her and calibrate her to me, and then she does that. And then I have other people to help that. I have a lot of students, so I have a whole grading team. But what I do is I use rubrics. And I put the general comments like, oh, guess what? You lost 5 points. So under APA, it will have your title page, your abstract running, or your headers and in text and end of text citations. And so I'll just take off the point and have a comment, sorry, that says, these are wrong, go check it. And then at the bottom in the main submission comments, I'll say, see comments on paper. So I go after the general things rather than having to mark it every time on the paper. I put those things or conceptual feedback in the rubric and then specific feedback on the actual paper, because some students are never going to look at the specific feedback no matter what you do. But if they look at the general feedback in a rubric form, then at least they're getting a comment that says, one of the things I learned from AQ this last week or two is, oh, you did really good here, or you really didn't seem to connect your ideas. So then they can go back and look and see where I found that specific problem, but they at least have an idea of the general sorts of things that I'm doing. So it's a multi-level kind of thing, but then I don't waste my time on APA. I just say, oh, you didn't do this right, and it's in the rubric, and then that way I'm done with it. And it makes it easier to look over it when I'm looking at the actual paper, so that I'm not driving myself crazy going, really, seriously, you can't put a comma there? Just stuff like that.
And I think that this hits both foundational idea 4 and 5. We've already talked about them because you guys are such good students, right? But I also think that part of the problem is some students don't care, absolutely. And some students are super overwhelmed. And what we know about learning is, I'm sure Danielle already knows this, is that if we ask students to do higher order things, like answer Angie's huge policy question, like that's huge, right? If we ask them to do higher order things, there's not enough brain space sometimes for the lower order things, right? So I know that when I give, especially honor students, when I give them really hard questions, they start making stupid grammar mistakes. And I'm like, you're honor students, like, you know how to do this. And it really is like sort of a full brain space. I even noticed it with graduate students, right? You give them a new thing like a literature review and they suddenly have run-on sentences. I'm like, what is happening here? You're in a PhD program. And that's totally normal. So I think that's why foundational idea 4 and 5 are key here. And that is sort of the iterative process and the feedback. So I'm wondering, Danielle, if there's a balance, and maybe for your course there isn't. So just something to think about, throwing it out there. If there's a balance between choosing an assignment early on where APA doesn't matter as much, and maybe you don't even worry about marking it, but you make that really clear. Because I think the key too is if you don't mark something, students think they got an A on it, right? So they have to make that really clear. Like, I am not marking this for this reason. I want you to use your brain space on this thing. And then maybe working into it, or maybe using that as one of their revision cycles. So maybe they don't revise anything on content once, maybe like in the middle of the semester, and they only revise APA. I also know that if you make it a graded assignment where they have to revise it and not just do it again later, because we know that sometimes the application is tough, right? But they revise the actual thing that they screwed up on. And then if they have to write why they revised it, like that reflection piece is sometimes really key. So say you highlight things, and maybe you use something like Text Expander that can insert the Purdue OWL links for you so they have a place to go. And then you say, I want you for your second assignment to turn in all the highlighted things fixed, and then tell me why. Like, why was that screwed up? Oh, I forgot to put a page number with a quote, or I had to put the citation outside the quotation, like those little silly things. Because I think verbalizing that on a paper, and it will be one more step of grading for you. But if it's really important for your class, maybe get rid of something else that you can just focus on that. I don't know.
And I think you have to prioritize. Grammar and APA is not, it's 10% of my 100-page papers. But at the end of the day, I'm more concerned about the content and what they're communicating than those sorts of things. And I think that's part of why I use the rubric and don't stress over it too much. Maybe it makes me not perfect, but I would rather spend my time not correcting those things and they're either going to try hard to learn it or they're not going to bother to learn it anyway, has been my experience. And so there's my own brain space. There's only so much I'm willing to allocate to that. So you just have to figure out what your priorities are. Are you trying to get them to where they are at the micromanager stage where they can do all these little specific steps? And that might be really important in Angie's students, with their students, where they're out there in the professional world. Okay, well, it could be. There are some cases where that's important, but it's not for me. I mean,
No, I would say, for me, for example, I'd say it's important that you cite the source. I'm not going to stress over APA style, because a policymaker that's reading this brief doesn't care if it's APA, but they do care where you got the source from. So there are things like that, yeah, I have uttered the words, this is not a how to use Word class. So
okay, that's
I
good.
don't care if it comes in and it looks weird on Canvas. I mean, I've just had to say that. I don't, let's just blame Canvas and move on with our lives. But don't leave sources out. I don't, I do want them in APA, but yeah, I mean, yeah. And I want spelling right. So spelling and succinct sentences, there are certain things that actually matter, because you have to be succinct. You have to have tight writing. There is no space to have extra words, because these people do not have time for it. They, passive, like you don't want passive verbs. And it's not because, I mean, it has a real applied context. Policymakers don't have time.
Angie. And I think that's a key with Danielle too, is that audience is the real key here. So if Danielle's teaching graduate students, they're going to go out and be faculty members at some point. Like, it's important to know APA, or your papers are going to get rejected from those journals. And we know that it probably shouldn't be that way, but it is, right? So I think that highlight on audience. So this is why I do this, and this is why it's important. And then figuring out ways we know that what we give feedback on is what they focus on. And we know if we give feedback on too much, they don't know what to focus on. So really figuring out those cycles of what to give feedback on. And then at some point, I'm wondering if Angie can do something similar and say, I read all your papers, your 2-page papers, and I highlighted 3 to 4 sentences in each that are so long and wordy and terrible. And you just got to figure out why they are, like, fix it, right? Because I don't think it's always necessary that they know that it's because there are too many prepositional phrases or there's too much passive voice.
Just tell them to fix it.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
I mean, with graduate students, they should know passive voice, but yes, just tell them to fix it. And it's amazing what they do. And that could be a great time for a pair activity. And I'm wondering if APA can be the same way, like a pair activity, if you have some sort of synchronous activity. And even if you don't, you can still do a peer review thing. If it's asynchronous, as long as it's not on the self-paced platform, and it creates a problem. So I think that that's a time for you again to say, I've done my marking, I did my highlighting, you work with a peer and go figure it out. But then
I think that would work better if you had a list of general types of things that you've noticed that are wrong, so that students can be given not like the 5 things that they all do, so it's easy to pick, but a long list of things that they could say, okay, oh, well, I seem to have done that here. That way it doesn't require a whole lot of effort on your part or theirs. And they're still going through that list and they're going, oh, so it's going to trigger, oh, that's why that was that. That makes sense. Or maybe both of these things were wrong with this one. But I think that's a black box kind of thing with like, oh, go figure it out. I think I would personally react poorly to that. But if I'm giving a list of things to consider when I'm doing that, I think that would be a really, really good activity. And again, not time consuming for anybody.
And definitely do it in the middle of the semester. Like, don't do that the first couple of weeks, right? Like, after Danielle's like, I cannot mark another APA misuse in Canvas. Like, that's the time to pivot and say, now they're going to figure it out. We have 1 minute left. I want to respect your time. I feel like this was a panel discussion. Like, people should have come and joined us. We all learned so much today.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time.